A Jury of Her Peers is a short story written by Susan Glaspell in 1917. It tells the story of a group of people who investigate a murder and ultimately decide whether or not to prosecute the suspect. The story is set in rural America in the early 20th century and explores themes of gender roles and the nature of justice. The story begins with two women, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, who are accompanying their husbands on a visit to the home of John Wright, a local farmer who has been murdered. As the men search for evidence and talk with the neighbors, the women stay in the kitchen and begin to piece together the events leading up to the murder. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are both familiar with John Wright and his wife, Minnie Foster. Mrs. Hale remembers Minnie as a cheerful and outgoing woman, but since her marriage to John, she has become withdrawn and unhappy. Mrs. Peters recalls a similar transformation in her own life after her marriage. As the women explore the kitchen, they begin to notice small details that suggest Minnie was not happy in her marriage. They find a broken bird cage and a dead bird, which they realize had been Minnie's only companion. They also notice that the stitching on a quilt Minnie had been working on was uneven and haphazard, suggesting that she was not in a stable mental state. As they piece together these details, the women begin to sympathize with Minnie and understand why she might have been driven to murder her husband. When the men return to the kitchen, they are dismissive of the women's observations and decide to arrest Minnie based solely on the evidence they have gathered. The women are left alone in the kitchen to decide what to do. Mrs. Peters, who is married to the county sheriff, is torn between her loyalty to her husband and her sympathy for Minnie. Mrs. Hale urges her to take action, and together they decide to hide the evidence that would incriminate Minnie. The men return to the kitchen and are unable to find any evidence against Minnie. As they leave the house, they discuss the case and remark on the women's lack of interest in the investigation. They conclude that women are not capable of understanding the nuances of the law and should be left out of such matters. The story ends with Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters standing in solidarity with Minnie, having made the difficult decision to protect her from a justice system that they feel would be unjust. The story raises important questions about the role of women in society and the nature of justice. Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters are dismissed by the men as irrelevant and unimportant, but they are ultimately the ones who make the decision that saves Minnie from a fate they believe would be unjust. The story also explores the idea that justice is not always black and white, and that the law may not always be the best arbiter of what is right and wrong. In conclusion, A Jury of Her Peers is a powerful and thought-provoking story that challenges the reader to think deeply about the nature of justice and the role of women in society. Through the eyes of Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, we are given a glimpse into the lives of women in rural America in the early 20th century, and the challenges they faced in a society that was dominated by men. The story remains relevant today, reminding us that justice is not always straightforward and that we must always be willing to question our assumptions and look beyond the surface to find the truth.